Chapter 12. Blind Fury. Get this vessel into the sky. Now! I roared across the bridge, my voice easily cutting through the deafening shriek of the Krigere alarm. The crimson emergency lights painted the entire command deck in a bloody hue. On the primary view screens, the prison courtyard below has become a hellscape of smoke, fire, and rioting laborers. Suddenly and sounding frantic, the head engineer addressed me on the bridge comms. "Warlord, the secondary power conduits in Sector 4 are fluctuating from the blast radius," the lead engineer shouted over the alarms, his hands flying across the terminal. "Atmospheric thrusters require a full diagnostic cycle before—" "I do not care about diagnostics." I slammed my fist onto the command console, denting the reinforced alloy. "Seal all entry ports immediately. Override the safety protocols and force the engines to ignite. We get into the air, or I will personally execute every engineer on this deck. Move." Bartar stood beside me, his hands steady as he gripped his medical datapad. There was no fear in his eyes, only a profound, silent expression of concern as he stared at the chaotic monitors. He looked up at me, his voice measured but urgent. "Lord Van, the courtyard explosions, there will be mass casualties. The garrison forces will be completely overwhelmed." "Let the garrison burn," I snarled, not shifting my gaze from the flashing tactical displays. "My only priority is leaving this mine." Bartar nodded subtly, instantly seizing the tactical opportunity. "Then I must return to the primary medbay right now. I will prepare the trauma bays to receive any injured guards from your personal detail and monitor the structural vitals from there." "Yeah, do it," I ordered. "I want the ship secure." Bartar bowed quickly and slipped past the automated bridge doors. The moment the healer left, a wave of instinct washed over me. The dream from last night, the brown-skinned boy, the continuation of my almost extinct bloodline, it was all that mattered now. The rebels out in the courtyard were a distraction. If they were targeting the ship, they were targeting her. They were targeting my son. As I left the bridge, I drew my heavy sidearm and marched down the main gantry toward my private quarters, my heavy boots pounding against the vibrating metal floor plates. My heart was beating anomalously fast in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt since my very first battle in my youth. But this wasn't the thrill of combat. This was raw, paralyzing fear. I reached the reinforced threshold of my suite and swiped my biometric keycard. The titanium doors hissed open. "Ruth," I called out, stepping into the lounge, but only silence answered me. My eyes instantly darted to the low table. Her breakfast was still there. I bolted into the sleeping quarters. The bed was empty. She was gone. A cold, icy dread gripped my throat, instantly mutating into a blinding, white-hot fury. They had breached my inner sanctum. They had stolen my legacy. I snapped open my secure comm channel, my breath coming in ragged, furious gasps. "Royal Guard detail, report to the command corridor immediately." Within seconds, 2 of my most elite, heavily armored Krigere warriors materialized at the end of the long hallway, their Iklua drive raised, the flashing red emergency lights reflecting off their polished chest plates. They said, "Warlord Van," as they saluted me and waited for my orders. "The human woman has been taken from my quarters," I growled, the sheer malice in my voice. I checked the internal tracking grid on my wrist gauntlet, monitoring the automated lockouts. The intruders are clever, but they are foolish. They didn't head for the lower hangar bays. They are moving deeper into the ship's sublevels. I locked my sidearm into place, my eyes narrowing as I realized exactly where they were heading. "They are going for the prison hold," I said, whispering to myself, as a dark, lethal sneer began to twist my face. They are trying to rescue the other human. Move out, seal the lower bulkheads, and trap them in the prisoner bay, and I want them alive long enough to watch me tear them apart. Intruder alert! Intruder alert! The automated sirens continued to wail, echoing off the metallic walls as Trogon, Robert, Jake, and Ruth made their way down towards the lower decks of the prisoner hull. "We should be getting close," Trogon yelled out over the deafening klaxons, his weapon drawn as he cleared the corridors. Once they rounded the final reinforced corner, Ralph's cell was right there. Through the heavy containment gate, they could see him, battered but defiant, chained securely to the reinforced wall. "Ralph!" Ruth yelled out, her voice cracking with pure emotion. "I cannot believe we found you." Ralph looked up, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He was ecstatic to see his newly formed family standing before him. "I cannot believe that you all found me. I thought this was the end," he said jokingly. "Move back," Trogon ordered, stepping into the cell block. "I have to break these chains." Everyone stepped aside as Trogon produced a heavy-duty plasma cutter, tracing a blinding line of concentrated laser energy through the thick iron links. The metal sparked violently before snapping in two. The moment Ralph was free, Ruth ran straight into his arms, burying her face in his shoulder and giving him a deep, long hug. She wasn't alone in her relief. Robert and Jake immediately stepped forward, joining the embrace to welcome their brother back from the edge of death. "Here, brother," Trogon said, breaking the moment as he unsheathed two gleaming blades from his tactical rig and handed them over. "We have to fight our way out of this one." Before Ralph could even wrap his fingers around the hilts, the heavy pressure doors to the prisoner bay open with a violent rush of air. Stepping through the gates of Ralph's cell, flanked by two of his towering, heavily armed royal guards, was Warlord Van. "Jake, I have never been in a real fight. Now I find myself standing shoulder to shoulder with my friends in a claustrophobic metal box, trapped in a literal life-or-death situation. I have absolutely no desire to be here. I am not even armed with a weapon. But who am I kidding? Even if someone handed me a weapon right now, I wouldn't have the slightest clue on how to use it. Back home, I was always the skinny kid, and because of my small stature, I was picked on a lot. I know exactly how to take a punch, but I do not know the first thing about self-defense. College had become my sanctuary. It was the one place I was finally able to find my community, a place where my brain mattered more than my muscles. I was an engineer major. I practically lived at the library. Actually, that is the bitter irony of how I ended up in the stars to begin with. One late night, 2 years ago, while walking home from Mullet Hall, the sky tore open, and I was taken. I wish I was home. Instead, I am standing here in the belly of an alien warship, next to the only friends I have left in the universe, watching our executioner walk through the door. The moment Warlord Van stepped into the cell block, Ruth let out a heartbreaking, involuntary gasp. You could see the raw, paralyzing terror flood her face instantly. I am still not entirely sure what happened to her within the past 48 hours, but looking at her expression right now, I am 100% sure it was horrific. Robert didn't hesitate. He slowly shifted his weight, putting his own body directly in front of Ruth to shield her from the warlord's gaze. In front of them, Trogon and Ralph moved forward in perfect synchronization, planting their boots and preparing to fight. Van didn't even draw his weapon. He just let out a low, mocking laugh that echoed terribly against the iron walls, waving a lazy hand at his two royal guards to subdue Trogon and Ralph. He casually stood back, crossing his arms, ready to watch the impending slaughter. But Trogon and Ralph stood their ground. With a fierce cry, Trogon raised his Ichloa drive and blade, and Ralph tightened his grip on the two daggers he had just been given. Together, they charged. It was a terrifying and awe-inspiring sight to see. One of the massive guards threw a heavy, armored fist that connected hard with Ralph's jaw. The sheer force of the blow caught him off guard, causing him to lose his footing and hit the deck plates. My stomach dropped, but Ralph didn't stay down. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself back up, ducked under a secondary swipe, and drove his dagger directly across the guard's chest armor, striking between the interplate. Thick, glowing blue blood began to drip down from the guard's chest plates. The alien stared down at the wound, completely unable to believe that this puny, fragile human had managed to cut him. The shock lasted only a second before pure, unadulterated anger shone upon his face. Meanwhile, Trogon was holding up brilliantly. He moved entirely differently than the other Manadiettes. Although he was native to this world, his fighting style was completely unique. He fought with calculated tactical precision, choosing not to focus on brute strength but on leverage and agility. The second guard tried to lunge forward, attempting to tackle him to the floor. In a split-second reflex, Trogon dropped low, sliding cleanly between the giant's armored legs. He swept back up to his feet, fast as lightning, and spun around, his blade flashing in a clean arc that slit the guard's throat before the alien could even turn around. One down, one more to go. The remaining royal guard, distracted by his comrade's collapse, found himself completely cornered. Ralph and Trogon closed in on him from both sides like a pair of wolves. The guard had absolutely no chance. Working in tandem, they parried his heavy rifle and overwhelmed his defenses. With a brutal twist of his wrist, Ralph removed his blade from the guard's ribs. The massive enforcer crashed heavily into the floor, his blue blood pooling around their shoes. The room fell dead silent, saved for the rhythmic wailing of the intruder alarm. Ralph wiped the sweat from his brow, turned his blood-flecked gaze away from the corpses to face Van. The warlord was next. Van looked down at his two dead royal guards, without a single shred of expression. Slowly, deliberately, he unsheathed his own twin blades and shifted into a flawless combat stance, preparing for the attack. Then Trogon's voice cut through the heavy silence like a thick knife. "You are a coward, you are a murderer, and I will avenge my family." Lord Van looked toward Trogon, his expression smug and entirely unbothered. "I don't even know who you are, assassin. Your face is covered." Face. Trogon took two aggressive, heavy steps toward the warlord and ripped his tactical mask from his face. "You do not have to know my face, but you know my name," Trogon roared, his eyes blazing with decades of stored fury. "I am Trogon dis Jin Lao Moon, son of Lax Lao Moon, true heir of the Krigere." The moment those words left Trogon's lips, the smugness vanished from the warlord's face. You could see a violent, dark anger instantly ripple across Van's entire body. "You killed my mother as she wept over my father's dead body," Trogon spat, his hands tightening around his weapons. "Now I will cut your throat and end your reign." Lord Van just stood there, looking Trogon dead in the eyes. His voice dropped to a cold, lethal whisper. "Try your best, boy," he said smugly. At that exact moment, Trogon let out a deafening battle cry and charged directly at the tyrant. Ralph followed suit, moving in from the flank. Van was a veteran of 100 wars. He moved with unnatural swiftness, dodging the initial onslaught and pivoting to the other side of the room. As he spun, his right blade flashed out, cleanly bypassing Ralph's guard and driving deep into the right side of his chest, puncturing his lung. Bright, crimson blood immediately began to spill onto the floor. Ruth let out a piercing, heartbreaking scream. The sudden, desperate sound caught Lord Van's attention for a split second, enough of a distraction that Trogon was able to close the distance and strike a massive blow, landing a heavy punch right to the warlord's jaw, which did not faze Lord Van. It only seemed to make him angrier. With terrifying agility, he swept his right leg around in a vicious kick, clipping Trogon's legs out from under him. The moment Trogon crashed to the ground, Van brought his right blade down, stabbing Trogon deeply through the upper thigh, causing Trogon to let out a sharp yell of agony. Beside me, Ruth was completely frantic, violently trying to break free from Robert's grip to throw herself toward Ralph. Lord Van glared over at us, pointing a bloody blade at Robert, demanding that he hold her back. Before we could even process the chaos, Lord Van was standing over Ralph, pinning him down with a heavy boot and pressing a jagged dagger directly against his throat. Ralph was gasping, struggling to breathe as his lungs filled with blood. Van pulled him up with his collar, looking Ralph dead in the face. "Hunna min," Van growled in his native tongue, meaning, "She is mine." With a brutal thrust, he buried the blade directly into Ralph's chest. Ralph let out a groan as Van callously dropped his limp body back to the deck plates. The horrific sight caused Trogon to desperately try and stand to resume the attack, but his severed thigh muscle could no longer support his weight. Van didn't even look down. He simply flicked his wrist and threw his dagger across the room. The blade landed with a sickening thud in the upper right side of Trogon's shoulder blade. Van then stepped towards him, delivering a kick so brutal it launched Trogon backward, his head cracking violently against the steel cell walls. Trogon slumped forward, completely knocked out. Everything around me became a blur, a terrifying daze. All I could hear, through the ringing in my ears, was Ruth begging and sobbing, screaming for Van to stop. But he wasn't going to stop. The warlord reached down, lifting Trogon's unconscious body up by the throat, raising his blade for the final executioner's kill. But then the heavy prison bay doors hissed open. Stepping through the threshold was a middle-aged Manadiet warrior. He was fully dressed for war, a heavy brown cloak billowing behind him, and he held two massive, gleaming blades in his steady hands. He stared at the warlord, holding his unconscious son, his eyes burning with an ancient, unyielding power. "Leg fradai min, Lars overlater denna kampen to mennene," he commanded, his deep voice shaking the very walls of the room. "Put my son down. Let's leave this fight to the men."